It's Nick's Halloween Spooktackular.
So, Alan Moore, we're having dinner. And Alan has just written the longest, goriest sequence in From Hell. Written this great bit. I've got William Gull, right, it's the death of Mary Kelly. It all takes place, it's like 50 pages long, it all takes place in this one room. And he's describing what Jack the Ripper did to Mary Kelly. And then he pulls out her lungs and he holds them up and he's dangling her lungs in front of Natalie. The kidneys are over here, the liver, and somehow the lungs just tip me over the edge. And I said, Alan, I'm going to go sit outside on the pavement. And I got up, and the world was swaying very gently, and I headed out to the pavement. And as I walked through the restaurant, I heard from behind me a voice saying, well, 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 there goes Neil Scary Trousers Go.
Jack the Ripper, the most famous serial killer in history. An unknown man who has gone into the history books and is the bane of sleep for people all over the world. He left 5 bloody corpses in 1888 England, each like a finger from his handprint on the world. There have been hundreds of stories about Jack the Ripper, whodunits, case studies, armchair detectives, and you name it. He is a real-life icon, as famous as Hannibal Lecter or the Phantom of the Opera, and no one knows who he is. No one ever will, either. It's just one of those mysteries that gets more interesting the more you realize it's unknowable. Fortunately, he attracted the attention of one Alan Moore, who sought to write the definitive novel of his mythology. Moore claims he expressed interest in the case when he was reading Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. Holistic means, essentially, to analyze something completely and thoroughly, leaving no stone unturned to get at your goal. This would obviously apply to Moore's super complex story structure and the numerous branching threads of plot he likes to ramble on about. He thought that in order to solve the Ripper murders, he would have to solve Victorian London, and that's just what he did. There are references to almost every person, place, and event that could be found, and he ties them all together with the noose meant for Jack's neck. First, it's not a whodunit. I'm not spoiling anything by telling you that Dr. William Gull is the culprit and that there's no real chase between him and the detective. It delves deep into his psychology, looking at why he did it and how it has managed to go unsolved for so long. It really doesn't matter that Gull's the culprit. That comes from Jack Knight's, what an awesome name, The Final Solution, which blames him for it. He alleges that Gull was a Freemason, which wasn't true, and that it was a large conspiratorial web that linked back to the royal throne. In the comic, the initial reason is that Prince Albert let it out of the can and got a prostitute pregnant. She falls on hard times and tries to blackmail the royal family. She wasn't a prostitute because she was smart, and the Queen herself orders Gull to knock her and her friends off. The problem is that Gull is insane. He's been having visions of gods and monsters and foreseeing dark interpretations of the future. He's killing them for occultist mythical reasons, helping to ensure a male-dominated future, because he sees women up and coming as the dominant sex in society. There's an entire chapter where he goes around London and observes the strange occultist symbols, such as Cleopatra's Needle and other obelisks. He sketches them out on a map of London and forms an eerie pentagram, the sign of the devil himself. He uses the city of London as a sacrificial altar on which he makes his brutal offering. The story is much more than just Gull, though, as it really explores every character from this time period, from the prostitutes to the pimps, from the cops to the average Joe on the street, even into the royal family and a cameo from the Elephant Man himself. It looks at the whole spectrum of London and everything that went into the Ripper murders. It's marked by Moore's signature pacing and densely packed panel, the silent looks between dialogue that say so much more than words can, and is replete with blood and gore. Eddie Campbell is the artist this time, and he's done a bang-up job. Yes, the pictures are a tad ugly, garish even, and sometimes hard to follow. However, the black and white combined with the general poses make them look like actual drawings from this era. A similar technique was used with Moore's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but to much less effect. They could have tried to emulate the Victorian drawings perfectly, but they wouldn't have been able to capture the emotion, the dynamic faces. Granted, everyone kind of stilts through this thing, but there are more fluid shots here and there. I particularly like this one with Gull leaping from the night, his cape billowing in the wind. I mean, he actually took the famous image of Jack the Ripper with the top hat and the cape and still made the story more original and daring than anything that came before. That's talent. One thing I find interesting is that the killer is caught by chance. Gull offends a guy who pretends to be his sidekick, and the sidekick leads the detective to him as a prank. When the detective questions Gull about being the murderer, he responds simply, "I am." No arguments, no detective work. The answer is found simply out of the chaos of the world. This also connects with Gull's visions of the future, which seem to be completely accurate. Is he really seeing something otherworldly, or do his delusions just happen to be right? It makes me wonder about how Alan Moore deliberately didn't care who the culprit was and was more interested in looking into how something like this could happen in London or anywhere else, and maybe he just happened upon the right answer. Spooky. So Alan included two huge appendices in the back. The first is a page-by-page breakdown of the story where he lists all his sources and what inspired each scene, or if he fabricated it. Papers have been written on these notes. I couldn't even begin to do the research necessary for something like this. The second appendix is a bonus comic, if you will, showing how Moore got the idea and developed it. He goes on to speculate that it's impossible to ever catch the killer, and that each new attempt will result in a fractal flake trapped within the circle of autumnal London, 1888. The comic was turned into a movie in the late 90s and thus began Moore's long hatred of Hollywood. He hates all the movies based on his work, and with good reason. They don't accurately represent what he wrote about. They're just cheap cash-ins that slapped his name on there to make money. And that's the real horror right there. And he's been offered large sums of money for his work, all the riches of Hollywood at his disposal, and he said no. Why? Because he's a true artist who won't let some corporation tell him how much he's worth, and he's worth more to some fancy slips of paper. To me, at least, that's something inspiring. It really is. But we want horror, so here you go. From Hell also delves into Moore's obsession with the 20th century and how everything changed over its course. He postulates that Jack the Ripper ushered in the new century, and that the increasing complexities that presented were a result of these murderers in Whitechapel. In Gull's visions of the future, he exclaims his disgust with modern society, how women show themselves to men and yet we don't care. I often disagree with this viewpoint. I believe the world has always been this complex, maybe in a different fashion, but it was just as hard to live in 1650 as it was in 1986. I think people remember back to when they were young and knew less of the world around them, and they blame society at large for the toughness of the world. But I always ask myself, what if I'm wrong? I mean, so many people tell me this, that someone's got to know something, right? What if the world is becoming more and more complex, just like the fractal flakes, and before we know it, it will evolve into something too incomprehensible for us to live?
He says there's black, and there is white, and there is wrong, and there is right, and there is nothing. Nothing in between. That's what Mr. Anderson.